November 8th, 1965, a Monday. Sometime around noon, a hairdresser named Mark Sinclair lets himself into a 5-story townhouse on East 68th Street in Manhattan. He's got a standing appointment. His client is one of the most famous women in America. He walks through the house and finds her in a bedroom on the 3rd floor. She's in bed. She's dead. Now that alone is a tragedy, but what Sinclair is looking at doesn't really make any sense. She's fully clothed. She's dressed like she's ready to walk out the door, full makeup, her hair all did up. A book is propped open beside her bed, a book her friends say that she finished reading weeks ago. Oh yeah, and she's in the wrong bedroom. This is a 22-room townhouse. She has her own bedroom on the 5th floor. That's where she sleeps. It's where she keeps her things. But she's on the 3rd floor in a room that she almost never uses. There's no drinking glasses anywhere, no water on the nightstand, nothing to wash down whatever killed her. And here's the part that's really significant. For the last 2 years, this woman was carrying a thick file with her everywhere she went. A file she guarded like her life depended on it. It contained her private investigation into the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. And guess what? The file is gone. Vanished from that townhouse. The woman on that bed is 52-year-old Dorothy Kilgallen. And if you don't know that name, you should. And the fact that you probably don't is part of this story. In 1965, Dorothy Kilgallen is arguably the most powerful female journalist in the United States. She writes The Voice of Broadway for New York Journal American. It's a column syndicated to over 200 newspapers. She's a household face on CBS television quiz show, What's My Line, every Sunday night. It's a show pulling 25 million viewers a week. Ernest Hemingway called her one of the greatest women writers in the world. She's a feared investigative reporter with sources inside the Dallas Police Department, the FBI, the Defense Bar, and the mob. And for the last 2 years, she's been doing something that no other journalist in America had the guts or access to do. She covered the Jack Ruby trial from the defense table. She got a private jailhouse interview with Ruby that no other reporter in the country could get and obtained Ruby's secret Warren Commission testimony and published it in her paper before the government released it. She traced Ruby's connections to organized crime, specifically to Carlos Marcello, the boss of the New Orleans Mafia. And she told friends, colleagues, and at least one fellow journalist that she was about to blow the Kennedy assassination case wide open. Then she turned up dead in the wrong bedroom with a book she wasn't reading and a missing file. I'm John Genoa, and you're watching America's Strangest History. This is the tragic story of Dorothy Kilgallen, the reporter who knew too much. Dorothy Mae Kilgallen was born during a violent rainstorm on July 13th, 1913, in a low-rent apartment on Garfield Boulevard, Chicago. Her father, Jim, everybody called him Jimmy or Kill, was a Hearst newspaper reporter. Small guy, tenacious as heck. His editor once said that when Jim Kilgallen got hold of a story, he was like a bulldog, got his teeth in, never let it go. Remember that line because it describes the daughter even better than it does the father. Her mother was May. She was a redhead from Denver who wanted to be a singer. By the time Dorothy was 8 years old, she already decided what she wanted to be, a reporter like her dad. In 1930, she enrolled in the College of New Rochelle. Ursuline nuns ran the place. She lasted around a year. In the summer of 1931, her father pulled a favor with the city editor at the New York Evening Journal, got his 18-year-old daughter a 2-week trial as a cub reporter. Her mother hated the idea. Mae Kilgallen thought that female reporters were women who drank whiskey, sat on desks, and swore, kind of like the show Mad Men. Now, the newsroom in 1931 was a man's world. Women weren't getting big assignments like murder trials or politics. It was supposed to be in the background. Kilgallen didn't care. She begged for assignments. She haunted the criminal courts every day. And when she finally got her first murder trial story, the editor rejected it. She rewrote it. He rejected it again. She rewrote it 5 more times before it ran. That's the woman we're dealing with. Now, by 21, she's covering the Anna Antonio murder for hire case. A woman who paid 2 drug dealers $800 to kill her husband for $5,300 life insurance policy. Kilgallen's front page story covered the guilty verdict and later reported the details of the execution at Sing Sing. She's 21 years old and she's writing about electrocutions. Then in 1935, she gets the assignment that changes everything, the Bruno Hauptmann trial, kidnapping and murder of Charles Lindbergh's baby son. The press called it the trial of the century. Kilgallen sits directly behind Hauptmann in court, and at one point she taps the defendant on the shoulder. She's 22 years old, sitting behind the most infamous man in America, and she taps him on the shoulder and asks him about the kidnapping ladder. His lawyers told him not to talk to the press, but he was impressed that she had the nerve to ask. Now, in 1936, the Evening Journal enters Kilgallen in something called the Race Around the World. 3 newspaper reporters, 3 different papers. The rule is you can only use transportation available to the general public. Her competitors are 2 men from the New York World Telegram and the New York Times. Kilgallen gets 16 visas and a passport in 2 days. Her only luggage is a converted hatbox and a battery typewriter. She boards the Hindenburg in New Jersey. Yeah, that Hindenburg. Nazi SWAT stickers on the sides, 200 soldiers in military uniform waiting to jockey the airship into its hangar when it lands in Berlin. Now, from there, she takes planes, boats, trains, the Pan American China Clipper across the Pacific. England, France, Germany, Italy, Greece, Egypt, Iraq, India, the Philippines, China. She finishes in 24 days, 13 hours, and 51 minutes. She comes in second, but nobody remembers the guy who won. They remember her because she's the first woman in history to fly around the world on commercial airlines. She set the record for the fastest 5,000-mile span ever flown from Hawaii to New York. Eleanor Roosevelt sent a personal letter on White House stationery congratulating her. Amelia Earhart cheered her from across the country. She wrote a book about it called Girl Around the World. She was 23 years old now. Hollywood turned the book into a movie, a Warner Brothers comedy called Fly Away Baby. The credits read, based on an idea by Dorothy Kilgallen. She's not even 24, and she's got a newspaper column, a published book, a movie credit, and every woman in America knows her name. Now, I could spend the next 20 minutes talking you through every phase of her career, but here's the short version. In 1940, she marries Richard Colmar, a Broadway producer. 800 guests at the wedding. Tyrone Power is there. Milton Berle is there. Thomas Dewey, the guy who's going to run for president in 44, is there. They move into that townhouse on East 68th Street, and they become one of the most visible couples in New York. They've got 3 kids. They host a morning radio show together called Breakfast with Dorothy and Dick, and they go to every opening night, every supper club, every first name party in Manhattan. Meanwhile, Kilgallen's writing her column 6 days a week, year after year after year. She eventually passes 6,000 columns, 3.5 million words, and those columns aren't Broadway gossip. She's exposing corruption. She's naming names. She's publishing things that powerful people don't want published. She's also making enemies. And not small ones. Frank Sinatra hates her. Kilgallen published a column in '56 called The Real Frank Sinatra Story, where she went after his girlfriends, his drinking, and, this is the important part, his mafia connections. Sinatra's response? He had a tombstone with Kilgallen's name on it delivered to her office. Now, at the show at the Copacabana, Sinatra tells the audience, Dottie Kilgallen couldn't be here tonight. She's out shopping for a new chin. Then he says, let's all chip in and buy Dorothy a new chin. Then he lifts his drink, says, this is a toast to my enemies, and spits the whiskey on the floor. Says, that one's for Dorothy Kilgallen. Now, when friends told Sinatra he was going too far, he said, I'm not being rough enough. Now, why does the Frank Sinatra feud matter to this story? It's not an unreasonable question. Well, it's because it tells you who Kilgallen was willing to go after. Sinatra in 1956 isn't just a singer, he's connected. His world overlaps with the same organized crime figures who are going to become very relevant later in this story. And Kilgallen went after them anyway, in print, by name, all while knowing exactly who his friends were. In 1954, she covers the Sam Shepard murder trial in Cleveland. It's the case that later inspired the TV show and the Harrison Ford movie, The Fugitive. Kilgallen's trial coverage is so good, Time magazine says she's providing the best reporting of any journalist there. She signs autographs outside the courthouse, has dinner with both the prosecutor and the defense attorney. She's a bigger celebrity at trial than the defendant. Random House co-founder Bennett Cerf, who's also her co-panelist on What's My Line, signs her to write a book about the famous murder cases that she's covered. The working title, Murder One. In 1960, she gets a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. And then in August of 1962, something happens that's worth noting. Marilyn Monroe dies. And Kilgallen doesn't accept the official story. She starts asking questions in her column. Why was Monroe's bedroom door locked when she usually didn't lock it? Why was the light on if she was trying to sleep? Why did the first doctor on the scene call a second doctor before calling police? And why did it take 3 hours from when the housekeeper got worried to when the cops showed up? Kilgallen wrote, the story hasn't been told, not by a long shot. Now that's 1962, she's already got that instinct. When the official version doesn't add up, she pulls the thread. 14 months later, she's sitting in her Manhattan townhouse when the news breaks. November 22nd, 1963, Dallas, Texas, and everything changes. November 22nd, 1963, Kilgallen's watching TV in her townhouse when JFK lands at Love Field in Dallas. The motorcade rolls through downtown towards Dealey Plaza. At around 12:30 p.m. Central Time, shots ring out. Texas Governor John Connally, sitting in the car in front of JFK, shouts, "My God, they're going to kill us all." Kilgallen sits alone in front of her TV, tears in her eyes, watching Walter Cronkite tell America what nobody wants to hear. The president died at 1 p.m. Dallas time, 2 p.m. Eastern. Within hours, police arrest a 24-year-old named Lee Harvey Oswald. He worked at the Texas Book School Depository overlooking the motorcade route. He's also suspected of shooting Dallas patrolman J.D. Tippit during his escape. At police headquarters, officers tell Oswald he can cover his face with his hands if he wants. And his answer is, "Why should I hide my face? I haven't done anything to be ashamed of." Now, that night, despite the late hour on the East Coast, Kilgallen's glued to the TV. She watches the midnight press conference in Dallas. Reporters crowd around Oswald. He says, "I didn't kill the president. I didn't kill nobody." And then something happens during that press conference that Kilgallen catches. District Attorney Henry Wade tells the media that Oswald is a member of an anti-Castro Free Cuba committee. Seconds later, somebody in the back of the room shouts a correction. "Henry, that's the Fair Play for Cuba committee. Pro-Castro, not anti-Castro. In fact, it's the exact opposite." The man who shouted that correction? Jack Ruby, the owner of the Carousel Club, a strip joint in downtown Dallas. Now, why is a nightclub owner at a police press conference at midnight correcting the district attorney about the political affiliations of the man accused of assassinating the president? Well, it's going to matter later. 2 days later, Sunday, November 24th, 11:15 in the morning, Kilgallen's watching TV again. Police are transferring Oswald from the city jail to a more secure county jail. Camera crews are everywhere. The whole world is watching. Oswald comes out of the elevator flanked by 2 detectives. One of them, J.R. Lavelle, is wearing a white suit and a gleaming white Stetson's hat. Oswald's handcuffed to Lavelle's left wrist. Bright lights, flash bulbs, a swarm of reporters. No officers directly in front of the prisoner. At exactly 11:21 a.m., a man steps out of the crowd and fires a single shot into Oswald's abdomen at point-blank range. Oswald crumples, and the shooter is Jack Ruby. That's the same guy who was at the midnight press conference 2 days earlier, the same guy who corrected the DA. And Kilgallen's watching it happen live on national TV. Now the entire country's in shock. The president's been murdered, and 2 days later, the alleged assassin gets murdered on live TV inside a police building surrounded by law enforcement. Most journalists report the story and move on. The official narrative is already taking shape. Oswald was the lone gunman. Ruby was a grieving patriot who snapped. Case closed. Got that? Kilgallen doesn't buy it, not for a second. 7 days after the assassination on November 29th, she publishes a column that lands like a bomb. The headline, "The Oswald File Must Not Close." She goes straight at President Johnson. She writes that LBJ has been snatched up into an ivory tower and can no longer hear ordinary people talking candidly. She says if Johnson could walk invisible along the streets of the nation, he'd realize that the mystery of Lee Harvey Oswald must be solved and laid before the public down to the smallest shred of evidence. Then she asks the question nobody in the mainstream press is asking. How does a guy like Jack Ruby, the operator of a striptease honky-tonk, stroll in and out of police headquarters like it's a health club at a time when a small army of law enforcement is keeping a tight security guard on Oswald? She warns LBJ directly. She says if he doesn't satisfy the public's uneasy mind about the peculiar assassination of the assassin, he'll start the presidency by making a political mistake that could cost him the 1964 election. And then she writes something that's going to echo through the rest of this story. Justice is a big rock. When you pull it out from under one man, a lot of others fall too. She closes with this. The American people have just lost a beloved president. It's a dark chapter in our history, but we have the right to read every word of it. It can't be kept locked up in a file in Dallas. That's November 29th, 1963, 1 week after the assassination. And Kilgallen's already been publicly calling the whole thing into question. And she's not done. A few weeks later in December, she publishes another column. This one's called Still Live Topic. She writes about attending a party thrown by stage director Joshua Logan. The guest list includes Truman Capote, Alfred Vanderbilt, Billy Rose, the wife of Senator Jacob Javits, and the former president of Mexico. And Kilgallen writes that as she moved from group to group at this party, there wasn't a single person who didn't want to talk about the assassination, about Jackie Kennedy's fortitude, about the killing of Oswald, and about the mysterious figure who shot him, Jack Ruby. She says that you'd think that a crowd of sophisticates and celebrities might be tired of the topic by now, but they weren't. And if New York's elite couldn't stop talking about it, Kilgallen knew that the rest of America couldn't either. She's reading the room. She knows the story has legs, and she knows she's one of the only journalists in the country with the reputation, the connections, and the nerve to chase it. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, she's already working the phones. She's reaching out to contacts in Dallas, digging into Ruby's background. She's asking questions about his relationships, his finances, his movements in the days before the shooting. And within a few weeks, she makes a decision. She's going to Dallas to embed herself in the Ruby murder trial and get closer to the story than any other journalist in America. And what she finds out is tremendous. February 12, 1964, 20 months before her death, Kilgallen and more than 400 reporters from around the world converge on the Dallas County Courthouse in the rain. This is the biggest trial in America, possibly the biggest trial in the world. Jack Ruby's charged with the murder of Lee Harvey Oswald. The whole planet saw him do it on live TV. There's no question of guilt, only what happens next. At a few minutes before 9 in the morning, lead defense attorney Melvin Belli walks in. Ruby joins him at the counsel table, and Belli announces his defense strategy. Not guilty by reason of psychomotor epilepsy insanity. Got that? It made no sense, because here's the thing about Belli. Marvin Belli isn't a criminal defense attorney. He's a civil lawyer, a personal injury guy. Life magazine called him the king of torts. He'd won massive verdicts against corporations like Coca-Cola and Cutter Laboratories. He was brilliant in the courtroom, but he never tried a capital murder case. Kilgallen picks up on this immediately and uses her San Francisco context to dig into Belli's background. She wants to know how a civil attorney with no capital murder experience ended up representing the man who shot the president's alleged assassin. It's a good question, and the answer she finds is murky. Belli told different stories in different books about how he got hired. One version said that Ruby's brother Earl saw him in an LA courtroom and was impressed. Now that turned out to be false. Belli's own associate, Seymour Ellison, later said that it came from a call from a Las Vegas businessman, someone in the entertainment industry. Las Vegas entertainment industry? Curious. Kilgallen arrives at the trial and she's a spectacle. She's signing autographs in the hallways. Deputies have to shoo her fans away. But she's not there for attention. She's there because she knows something the other 400 reporters don't seem to care about. She's looking past the trial, past the insanity defense, past the question of whether Ruby is crazy. She's asking, why did Ruby kill Oswald? And who put him up to it? On February 24th, her column runs another headline, DA to link Ruby to Oswald. She writes that among those who know the seedy side of Dallas show business, the betting's 10-1 that District Attorney Hank Wade will produce a witness who will testify that Ruby and Oswald knew each other. She points out that Ruby claims he doesn't remember, but his plea is temporary insanity, so there are a great many things he doesn't remember and isn't about to. Then she floats a theory. Ruby's Carousel Club had its unsavory aspects. If Oswald checked in there a couple nights a week, he could have made some extra money. That would explain how a guy making $50 a week could afford trips like the one he made to Mexico. It would also explain why Oswald was renting a room in the heart of Dallas 5 nights a week and only joining his wife and kids in the suburbs on Fridays and Saturdays. Nobody else in the American press is writing this. Nobody. She's connecting Ruby to Oswald when the official story says they were strangers. Meanwhile, during the trial, Kilgallen does something that would have made her father proud. On a cold and windy morning before the court convenes, she visits Dealey Plaza. She walks the street in front of the book depository. She examines the exact spot where the shots were fired. She looks up at the 6th floor window where Oswald allegedly fired his rifle and walks towards the grassy knoll and the overpass. Whatever she concludes, it goes in her file. Back at the courthouse, Kilgallen's at the defense table. There are photographs of her leaning in, whispering in Joe Tannehill's ear during the proceedings. She's got access that no other journalist has, and it's driving people crazy. She keeps pressuring Belli for a private interview with Ruby. Belli keeps telling her that it's impossible, that Ruby's crazy. Now, Kilgallen disputes that. She doesn't believe Ruby's insane. She thinks he's scared, and she notices something else. Belli won't let Ruby testify. Ruby wants to get up on the stand. He wants to tell his story, but Belli tells him that if the prosecution gets him up there, they'll cut him to ribbons. And Ruby backs down. Kilgallen watches this dynamic closely, a defendant who wants to talk, a lawyer who won't let him. Now, in April, during the trial, she publishes another column. This one's called, "Why Did Oswald Risk All by Shooting a Cop?" It's a sharp piece of thinking. She writes that a mysterious and significant aspect of the events after the assassination has never been explored publicly. Why did Oswald, if he was fleeing the police after shooting the president, approach patrolman J.D. Tippett's car in broad daylight while witnesses were standing by and shoot the man? I mean, think about it. After that point, Oswald managed to slip away from the book depository without being identified. He wasn't a reckless guy. A man on the run from a spectacular crime doesn't seek out a policeman unless he's turning himself in, and Oswald clearly wasn't doing that. Kilgallen writes that a whodunit fan would infer that the policeman knew something about Oswald that was so dangerous the policeman had to be silenced at any cost, even Oswald's chance at escape and freedom. On March 14th, 1964, the jury comes back guilty, death by electric chair. Belli is stunned. He calls Dallas a city of shame. Kilgallen notes his theatrics, but she's focused on something else. Ruby's going to appeal, which means he's still alive, still in a cell, presumably still available for conversation. And during the course of the trial, Kilgallen was working Belli. She sensed his weaknesses. Belli fancied himself a future actor. He wanted Hollywood connections. Kilgallen had those connections, and a trade of sorts was forming. But it wasn't Belli who finally made it happen. It was co-counsel Joe Tuinal. Tuinal, a towering Texan from Jasper who'd grown fond of Kilgallen during the trial, arranged for her what no other journalist in America could get: a private face-to-face sit-down with Jack Ruby. No other reporters, no cameras, just Dorothy Kilgallen and the man who killed Lee Harvey Oswald, alone in a room. What he tells her in that room is going to haunt her for the rest of her life, which, turns out, isn't very long. February 1964, during a noon recess at the Ruby trial, the press has already filed out of the courtroom and Kilgallen stays behind. Co-counsel Joe Tuinal walks over to the 4 deputy sheriffs guarding Ruby and tells them Kilgallen wants to ask his client some questions. They say, okay. Ruby gets up from the defense table. Kilgallen's standing on the other side of the rail. He steps towards her, and Kilgallen starts writing. She later describes his eyes as shiny brown and white, bright as glass as eyes of a doll. He tries to smile. It doesn't work. When they shake hands, she describes him as trembling ever so slightly, like the heartbeat of a bird. He tells her, "I'm nervous and worried. I feel I'm on the verge of something I don't understand. The breaking point, maybe." Now, Kilgallen tells him that she thinks he's holding up well. His response, "I'm fooling you, Dorothy. I'm really scared." They talk for about 8 minutes. Tuinal later says that he wasn't paying close attention to the conversation. He mentions that Kilgallen brought up a San Francisco opera singer who was a friend of Ruby's and wanted to pass along a message. That's how Kilgallen got in the door. She had information that Ruby wanted, but what she got back was far more valuable. Ruby says he wanted to help people. He says maybe he could bring people to God. He tells her that before all this happened, he didn't make much of his life, but he's had a lot of time to think, and he doesn't want to go back to what he was. He wants to do something better. Kilgallen asks if he's aware that his defense team is going with the insanity plea, essentially trying to establish that he was a homosexual and if that bothers him. Ruby's answer, "It's not true, but I expect it to come up. Actually, I like girls, but I'm a bachelor, and they're going to make some remarks that were just jokes to me, but might strike some people as scandalous." Then he says, "I'm grateful for you coming to see me, Dorothy." He says, "God bless you," and then Ruby leaves and walks out of the courtroom. Kilgallen goes back to her hotel room and writes the story. It's under the headline, "Nervous Ruby Feels Breaking Point Near." She publishes every detail. The glass doll eyes, the trembling hands, the fear. But here's what she doesn't publish. She doesn't say a thing about whatever else Ruby said during those 8 minutes, because 8 minutes is a long time, and the published column accounts for maybe 2 or 3 minutes of that conversation. The rest goes in her file. Now hold on to that image in your head. Ruby trembling, Ruby scared, Ruby saying that he's at a breaking point, because 4 months later, on June 7th, 1964, Ruby gets another visitor. This time it's the Chief Justice of the United States. Earl Warren travels to the Dallas County Jail with members of the Warren Commission to take Ruby's testimony. And what happens in that room is one of the most disturbing exchanges in American legal history. Ruby's first words, before he's even sworn in, are a request for a lie detector test. He says, without a lie detector test on my testimony, my verbal statements to you, how do you know I'm telling the truth? Now, Warren tells him that they can arrange that if he wants it. Ruby says yes, and his attorney agrees. Then Ruby starts talking, and he can't stop. He tells Warren that his lawyer Belli never understood the case. Belli tried to get him off on insanity when Ruby wanted to get on the stand and tell the truth about what happened that morning. But Belli warned him, Jack, when they get you on the stand, you are actually speaking of premeditated crime. Ruby says he didn't care. He wanted to tell the truth anyway, but he didn't get that chance. As the testimony goes on, Ruby becomes more and more agitated. He tells Warren, gentlemen, my life is in danger here. Warren asks if he's sober. Ruby says, do I sound sober enough to you? Warren says, yes, you sound entirely sober. Then Ruby says, I may not live tomorrow to give any further testimony. Curious. The man who killed Lee Harvey Oswald is sitting in front of the Chief Justice of the United States, telling him he may not live to survive another day. Then Ruby says something that should have stopped the whole investigation in its tracks. He asks Warren to take him to Washington. It's not a casual request. It's more of a desperate plea. He says, I want to tell the truth, and I can't tell it here. I can't tell it here. He asks Warren directly, if you felt that your life was in danger at this moment, how would you feel? Wouldn't you be reluctant to go on speaking? Warren admits that he might have some reluctance, yes, but Ruby pushes harder. He says the testimony has something to do with you, Chief Warren. He asks if Warren has the power to take a prisoner back to Washington. Warren says no, they don't typically do that. And Ruby's response? Yes, but those people aren't Jack Ruby. And Warren doesn't take him to Washington. The commission wraps up the testimony in nearly 4 hours. And Ruby's last words? All I want to do is tell the truth, and the only way you can know is by polygraph. And then this. Well, you won't ever see me again, I'll tell you that. That's it. Warren tells him frankly he doesn't think Ruby is stating the facts, and that's it. The session ends, Ruby stays in Dallas, he never gets taken to Washington. The polygraph test eventually happens weeks later, but the results are ruled essentially useless because of Ruby's mental state and the examiner's own doubts about the conditions. Ruby dies of cancer in a Dallas hospital on January 3rd, 1967. He never tells his full story. Now, Kilgallen doesn't have access to his testimony when it happens. It's classified. The Warren Commission isn't releasing transcripts. But Dorothy Kilgallen's been doing this job for 30 years. She has sources everywhere, and sometime in the summer of '64, she obtains a copy of the full 102-page Ruby transcript. And on August 9th, 1964, she publishes it in the Journal American before the government releases it. The headline reads, "Stories quote Ruby saying slaying was his own idea." She introduces the transcript to the readers by writing, "What you are about to read is a word-by-word account of the 3-hour, 5-minute interrogation of Jack Ruby, the third member of a triangle that has become an irrevocable part of history. The FBI is furious. They want to know how she got it. They launch an investigation into the leak." Kilgallen's response, published in a later column, "From what I've read, I would be inclined to believe that the FBI might be more profitably employed in probing the facts of the case rather than how I got them." That October, she publishes another column, "Maybe You Didn't Know," and she tears the Warren report apart. She calls the whole thing a mite too simple. She writes, "A chap kills the president of the United States, escapes, kills a policeman, eventually is apprehended in a movie theater under circumstances that defy every law of police procedure, and subsequently is murdered under extraordinary circumstances." Then she lands the punch. The Warren report made great effort to note that the FBI and the Secret Service were delinquent in their duty and that the press were also responsible for the confusion that made Oswald's murder possible. Baloney. Oswald wasn't killed by a newspaper man. He was killed by a nightclub owner well known to the police, Jack Ruby. How could the Warren Commission pretend to forget that? She also writes a column called Search for the Truth, where she analyzes Ruby's testimony. She describes him as having opened the floodgates of his mind and unloosed a stream of consciousness. She notes that Ruby was filled with fear for his own life, fear for his brothers and sisters. And then she writes this: "It seemed to me after reading the testimony 3 times that the Chief Justice and the General Counsel were actually aware of the talk both here and in Europe that President Kennedy was the victim of a conspiracy. They took pains to prove to themselves and to the world that no conspiracy existed." That's Kilgallen's accusing the Warren Commission of working backward from a conclusion. And by the fall of 1964, she's telling people close to her that she's going to crack this thing wide open. She's building a book. She's got the file. She's got sources in Dallas, New York, New Orleans, Washington, and she's making a trip to New Orleans to dig into the one name that keeps coming up at the center of everything: Carlos Marcello. So who was Carlos Marcello, and why does the name keep showing up? Well, here's the short version. Carlos Marcello is the head of an organized crime network in Louisiana and a significant portion of the southeastern United States. Now, by 1963, his operation is grossing hundreds of millions a year. 500 million from illegal gambling alone. Another 100 million from syndicate-connected bars. He owns 6,500-acre estate called Churchill Farms outside New Orleans, worth 22 million. And he's not a flashy New York mobster. He's quiet. He's Sicilian-born but raised in Tunisia. He grew up with what one author described as both Sicilian and Arabic vendetta tendencies. And when someone crosses Carlos Marcello, the consequences are bad. According to his biographer, if anyone ever double-crossed the Don, the man ended up being strangled and his body thrown in a tub of caustic acid. The remains were then dumped in a swamp where alligators would take care of the rest. That's who we're talking about here. Now, in 1960, John F. Kennedy wins the presidency, and part of how he wins is through the mob. Kennedy's father, Joe Kennedy, needed help in the West Virginian primary and in Illinois. He recruited Frank Sinatra. That's the same Sinatra that Kilgallen was feuding with, to act as an intermediary with Chicago mob boss. Sinatra's own daughter, Tina, confirmed this on 60 Minutes. The mob delivered votes, and Kennedy won. Then JFK does something the mob doesn't expect. He appoints his brother Bobby as Attorney General, and Bobby Kennedy doesn't play nice. RFK launches an all-out war on organized crime. He goes after Giancana in Chicago, Trafficante in Tampa, and he goes after Marcello in New Orleans with a vengeance. In April 1961, Bobby Kennedy has Marcello unceremoniously deported to Central America. Just grabbed him and dumped him in Guatemala. Marcello nearly dies wandering through the jungle before he sneaks back into the United States. Giancana is quoted as saying, "That rat bastard, we broke our balls for him and gave him the election, and he gets his brother to hound us to death." And Marcello? Well, Marcello's response is chilling. According to the HSCA report, Marcello told an informant, "The president was the dog, the attorney general was its tail. If you cut off the tail, the dog will keep biting. But if you chop off the head, the dog will die, tail and all." That's not just a metaphor, it's a plan. And on November 22nd, 1963, during a break in his own conspiracy trial in New Orleans, one of Marcello's underlings, a man named David Ferry, taps him on the shoulder and says, "Our troubles are over. JFK is dead." After the jury retries, Marcello is acquitted within an hour. Now here's where Ruby fits in. The Warren Commission concluded that Ruby had no significant connections to organized crime. They devoted an entire appendix to his biography and painted him as a troubled loner who ran a couple of seedy nightclubs. But that's not what the phone records show. In the weeks before his assassination, Ruby made a series of calls that the HSCA later described as going to individuals who may be fairly characterized as having been affiliated directly or indirectly with organized crime. On October 26, 1963, Ruby calls Irwin Weiner, a Chicago bondsman and known frontman for organized crime and the Teamsters Union. On October 30th, Ruby calls the trailer park office at Nofia Pecoraro. Pecoraro is the lieutenant of Carlos Marcello. On November 7th and 8th, Ruby makes 2 calls to Barney Baker, a lieutenant of the Teamster boss Jimmy Hoffa and an associate of several convicted organized crime hitmen. Baker initially denies the second call ever happened. Ruby also contacts Murray Dusty Miller, another Teamster deputy of Hoffa with ties to underworld figures. He also calls James Henry Dolan, a Dallas Union rep who was reportedly an acquaintance of both Carlos Marcello and Santos Trafficante, the mob boss from Tampa. When the HSCA investigated these calls 15 years later, the official explanation was that Ruby was dealing with a labor dispute at his nightclubs. And to be fair, some of those calls probably were about that, but the committee wasn't satisfied. Weiner refused to discuss his call with the FBI in 1964. Baker denied the call that the phone records proved happened. Pecoraro claimed that he never spoke to Ruby despite the records showing the call to his personal phone line. And the committee's conclusion? The pattern of contact showed that the individuals who had motive to kill the president also had knowledge of a man who could be used to get access to Oswald in the custody of the Dallas police. They're talking about Ruby, a man with a violent nature, a man in serious financial trouble, a man with a friendly and somewhat unusual relationship with the Dallas Police Department that may have been a factor in his entry to the police basement on November 24th of 1963. Ruby's closest friend in Dallas, Joe Campisi, described by Ruby's own sister as one of his 3 closest friends. Campisi operated the Egyptian Lounge and was a known associate of the Marcello crime organization. And who was the first person to visit Ruby in his jail cell after he shot Oswald? Joe Campisi. Now think about what Kilgallen was doing. She's tracing these exact connections. She's following Ruby's past and his mob ties and asking who put Bulleye on a case and why a civil attorney with mob clients ended up defending the most important criminal defendant in America. She's writing columns connecting Ruby to Oswald when official lines say that they were strangers. And then she goes to New Orleans. According to author Lee Israel, Kilgallen was tracing Ruby's past and his mob ties. According to Johnny Ray's biographer, Johnny Whiteside, who interviewed Ray before he died, Dorothy told Ray that she was planning a trip to New Orleans to further research into Lee Harvey Oswald's background and his connections there. Whiteside specifically notes Kilgallen was investigating what he called a daunting contradiction between Oswald's pro-Cuba street politics and his incongruous associations with right-wing conservatives and the Carlos Marcello crime family. She connected the 3 men, Ruby, Oswald, Marcello. And she wasn't being quiet about it. She was telling people, she was writing a book. She said she was going to expose the truth. Random House co-founder Bennett Cerf, her co-panelist on What's My Line, signed her to write a book years earlier. The file she carried everywhere, the one she guarded so closely, contained her research, her notes, her source contacts. Whatever Ruby told her during those 8 minutes in that Dallas courtroom. But Marcello heard her footsteps. Kilgallen was the one person still alive who could connect him to the assassination. She was doing what Bobby Kennedy's Justice Department tried and failed to do. She was building a case, but not in a courtroom, but in the pages of the most widely read newspaper column in America, and also in a book that could trigger a grand jury investigation leading directly to Marcello's doorstep. As the HSCA letter stated, Carlos Marcello had the motive, the means, and the opportunity to have President John F. Kennedy assassinated. If he had the motive, the means, and the opportunity to kill the president, what do you think he's going to do to a reporter? Well, it's the fall of 1965. Kilgallen appears on What's My Line on Sunday, November 7th. The show's moderator, John Daly, later says, she was just full of beans that night. She's in great spirits. After the taping, she goes home, she writes her column. Sometime in the early morning hours of November 8th, something happens inside that townhouse. By noon the next day, Dorothy Kilgallen is dead. So let's get back to November 7th, 1965, and walk through her last hours. After the taping, she writes her Voice of Broadway column and files it with the Journal American. Then, sometime in the late hours, she goes out. She ends up at a bar called the Regency Hotel. It's about 6 blocks from her townhouse, and she's not alone. Multiple witnesses see Kilgallen sitting in a dark corner booth with a man nobody can identify. A woman named Catherine Stone, who'd actually been a contestant on that night's What's My Line episode, sees Kilgallen at the Regency. Other patrons notice her there too, in a booth that's dark, and the descriptions of the man are incomplete. Nobody's ever been able to conclusively identify who Kilgallen was drinking with in those final hours. Now, at some point, she returns to the townhouse, and sometime between the early morning hours and noon of November 8th, Dorothy Kilgallen dies. Now, at the beginning of this video, I gave you broad strokes of the scene, but I left out the details that matter most, and here they are now. When Sinclair finds her in that 3rd floor bedroom, she's not just wearing clothes and makeup, she's wearing false eyelashes, a hairpiece, the whole production. That's what she wore in public, not what she wore to bed. Her hairdressers confirmed that she never went to bed and she never went to sleep like that. The book beside her, according to friends, she already finished reading it. It's propped open like a stage direction, like someone placed it there to make the scene look natural. No drinking glasses in the room, no water bottle, nothing to wash down pills. And if you're a woman who takes sleeping pills at night, which Kilgallen did, she had a prescription from her personal physician, a Dr. Baldwin. Under those circumstances, you keep a glass of water on the nightstand. Its absence is curious. But here's where it gets really interesting. The autopsy. Dr. James Luke, the assistant medical examiner, performs the autopsy on the afternoon of November 8th. The initial exam that night fails to determine the cause of death. He tells the press further tests are needed. When the toxicology results come back, they show 2 drugs in Kilgallen's system. The first is Seconal. That's her prescribed sleeping medication. Finding Seconal wouldn't have surprised anybody. The second is Tuinal, and Tuinal is a completely different animal. It's a toxic combination of two active ingredients, amylbarbital sodium and secobarbital sodium. The window between a dose that makes you drowsy and a dose that kills you is extremely narrow. And when you mix it with alcohol, the effects accelerate dramatically. Physicians who prescribe Tuinal strictly forbid the use with any alcoholic beverage. Kilgallen had no prescription for Tuinal. Her doctor prescribed Seconal, not Tuinal. There's no record of her ever being prescribed it by anyone. Her blood alcohol level at the time of the autopsy was 0.15. Now that's nearly twice the legal limit. And since the autopsy happened hours after death, the actual level at the time she died would have been significantly higher. So you've got a woman with a known Seconal prescription who somehow also has Tuinal in her system. It's a drug she had no access to through legitimate channels, combined with a blood alcohol level that makes the barbiturate cocktail exponentially more dangerous. Dr. Luke knows this doesn't add up. On November 15th, a full week after the death, he writes his final determination. Acute ethanol and barbiturate intoxication. Circumstances undetermined. Those last two words are doing a lot of heavy lifting here. Circumstances undetermined. It's a medical examiner saying that means I know what killed her, but I can't explain how it happened. He can't call it an accident because Tuinal doesn't make sense. He can't call it a suicide because nothing else points in that direction. And he can't call it a homicide because he's a medical examiner, not a detective, and nobody's asking him to do it. So he punts. Circumstances undetermined. And nobody picks it up. The NYPD doesn't open a homicide investigation. They don't interview the mystery man at the Regency. They don't investigate how Tuinal got into her system. They don't ask why she was in the wrong bedroom, or why the JFK file is missing, or why the death scene looks staged. They treat it as routine. The most famous female journalist in the country dies under undetermined circumstances, and the New York City Police Department does nothing. Kilgallen herself may have seen this coming. She told her hairdressers Mark Sinclair and Charles Simpson, "After I found out now what I know, if the wrong people knew what I know, it would cost me my life." That's a woman who understands exactly who she's investigating. Author and JFK researcher Mark Lane later recounted her conversation with Kilgallen. He asked her if she was afraid. Her answer, "That's all inconsequential. They killed the President of the United States. The government's not prepared to tell us how it happened or who did it. And I'm going to do everything I can to find out what happened." She knew the risk. She accepted it. And then there's the file. 2 years of investigation, hundreds of hours of research, source contacts in Dallas, New York, New Orleans, Washington, notes from her private interview with Ruby, whatever he told her during those 8 minutes that she didn't publish, her draft manuscript for the book that Random House signed her to write, all of it gone. Nobody's ever found it. Not the NYPD, not her family, not the journalists who came after her, the researchers who spent decades digging into the case. The file that could have connected Ruby to Oswald, to Marcello, the file that the most tenacious investigative reporter of her era was building since November of 1963, vanished from a 22-room townhouse on the same night its author died under undetermined circumstances with an unprescribed drug in her bloodstream. Got that? And the system that was supposed to ask questions, the police, the medical examiner's office, the press, simply didn't. Her column ran in the Journal American the next day. Even in death, Dorothy Kilgallen was still being published. But nobody was investigating who killed her. Curious. For more than a decade after Kilgallen's death, nothing happens. The Warren Report stands as the official account. Oswald acted alone. Ruby acted alone. No conspiracy, case closed. The JFK file was never found. Kilgallen's book is never published, and her investigation dies with her. Slowly, steadily, she gets erased from history. The major books on assassination don't mention her. Documentaries leave her out. The college courses and the academic conferences treat the JFK case as if Dorothy Kilgallen never existed. The woman who ran the most aggressive independent investigation into the murder of a sitting president, who published leaked government testimony, who sat across from Ruby, who looked into his eyes, who connected the dots between Dallas and New Orleans before anyone in the government would admit those dots existed, written out of history. Just like that. But in 1976, something changes. The United States House of Representatives establishes the House Select Committee on Assassinations, the HSCA. Their mandate is to reinvestigate the murders of President John F. Kennedy and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. This isn't a fringe effort. This is the United States Congress saying, we need to look at this again. So the committee spends 3 years investigating. They interview witnesses, subpoena records, they hire forensic experts, acoustic analysis, organized crime specialists. They dig into the areas the Warren Commission never touched, and in 1979, they published their findings. The headline conclusion: the committee believes, on the basis of the evidence available to it, that President John F. Kennedy was probably assassinated as a result of a conspiracy. That's not a conspiracy theorist on a podcast. That's the official finding of a congressional investigation with subpoena power and a 3-year mandate. Now, they couldn't identify the other gunman. They couldn't determine the full extent of the conspiracy, but they were definitive about several things. First, the Warren Commission failed to investigate adequately the possibility of a conspiracy to assassinate the president. Failed. That's the word they used. The Warren Commission arrived at its conclusion in good faith, the HSCA said, but presented them in a fashion that was too definitive, meaning that the commission stated as absolute fact what was, at best, an incomplete conclusion. Second, the FBI was seriously delinquent in investigating Jack Ruby's connection to organized crime. Seriously delinquent. The bureau that was supposed to chase every lead, but instead buried the ones that pointed towards the mob. The committee found that Ruby's links to organized crime figures should have been more thoroughly explored in 1964, when memories were clearer and related records were available. They're saying the FBI had the chance to follow the trail and chose not to. Third, the committee examined whether the National Syndicate of Organized Crime as a group was involved in the assassination. Their finding? The syndicate as a group was not involved. But, and this is the critical part, the available evidence does not preclude the possibility that individual members may have been involved. Individual members. They're talking about Marcello, about Trafficante. The committee investigated both men directly. They examined the phone records, the intermediaries, the chain of associations linking Ruby to Marcello, like Joe Campisi and James Henry Dolan. And their conclusion about those phone calls Ruby made in the weeks before the assassination, the pattern showed that individuals who had motive to kill the president also had knowledge of a man who could be used to get access to Oswald in the custody of the Dallas police. They also found that the CIA had been running joint operations with organized crime figures to assassinate Fidel Castro, operations that gave the mob leverage over the agency and created a web of relationships between government intelligence and the underworld that nobody in 1964 wanted to untangle. The committee found that the Secret Service was deficient in its performance of its duties, that the Department of Justice failed to exercise initiative in supervising the FBI's investigation, that the CIA was deficient in its collection and sharing of information both prior to and subsequent to the assassination. Every institution that was supposed to protect the president and then find the truth about his murder failed. And every failure the HSCA identified in 1979, Kilgallen identified in 1964. She said the Warren Commission was working backwards from the conclusion. The HSCA confirmed it. She said Ruby's organized crime connections were being buried. The HSCA confirmed it. She said there was something queer about the killing of Oswald. The HSCA confirmed that one too. She connected Ruby to Oswald to Marcello. The HSCA spent 3 years and millions of dollars arriving at the same conclusion. The only difference? When Kilgallen said it, she was dismissed as a gossip columnist overstepping her bounds. When the HSCA said it, they had the authority of the United States Congress behind them. But Kilgallen said it first. She said it louder. And she said it when saying it was dangerous. The HSCA published their report in 1979. They recommended that the Department of Justice investigate further. The Department of Justice reviewed the findings and declined to pursue the case. Nobody was ever charged. Marcello died in 1993, reportedly from Alzheimer's disease in his final years. He was never prosecuted for any involvement in Kennedy's assassination. Trafficante died in 1987, same story. Ruby died in 1967, 2 years after Kilgallen. He never told his story. He never got to Washington. And Kilgallen, we know she died in 1965 with Tuinal in her bloodstream and a missing file and a medical examiner who couldn't explain how it happened. 13 years later, the government proved that she was right about everything. But proving her right and giving her justice are two very different things. I'm John Genoa, and you've been watching America's Strangest History. Thanks for watching. Catch you later.